Giovanni Rossi, a university professor with a hidden agenda, and Alessia Ferraro, a clerk living a double life, were ordinary. Italians by day, but by night they became architects of fear, masterminding a campaign of bombs, blood, and betrayal that would tear Italy apart. Italy in the late 1970s appeared calm to the casual observer. Streets hummed with life. Cafes overflowed with patrons enjoying espresso and conversation, and families strolled along cobblestone avenues, unaware of the storm brewing in the shadows. On the surface, it was a nation thriving on culture, art, and tradition. Yet beneath the veneer of normalcy, tensions simmered. Political unrest had begun to spread like a slow poison through the country. Extremist ideologies were gaining footholds in quiet neighborhoods, infiltrating workplaces, universities, and even government institutions. Small groups of radicals met in hidden apartments, dusty basements, and abandoned warehouses, plotting acts that could shake the very foundations of Italian society. These cells were not made up of obvious criminals. Many were educated, seemingly ordinary citizens who hid their radical beliefs behind respectable jobs. Professors taught in universities by day and whispered plans of violence by night. Clerks and shopkeepers passed along intelligence without arousing suspicion. Some had military training, giving them a dangerous edge over law enforcement. Their motivations were varied. Some sought revenge against a system they considered corrupt. Others were driven by ideology, and a few simply hungered for power and notoriety. What united them was a shared willingness to sacrifice lives to achieve their goals, and a terrifying ability to blend into everyday life. Even the police and intelligence agencies were struggling to understand the extent of the threat. There were whispers of secret funding, encrypted messages, and connections to foreign powers. Investigators knew something ominous was building, but the clues were scattered and difficult to interpret. Ordinary citizens had no idea that their daily routines were slowly being infiltrated by men and women plotting bloodshed. Shops, schools, and public transport all seemed normal, yet each location could become a target at any moment. The contrast between the outward peace and the hidden menace created a tension that was almost invisible but suffocating. In the cities, life continued with a fragile normality. Trains ran on schedule, markets bustled with fresh produce, and children played in parks under the watchful eyes of their parents. Yet the extremists were already watching, studying patterns, and selecting potential sites for their first attacks. Meetings were held in the dead of night, codes were passed silently in the shadows, and weapons were moved from hidden caches to safe houses. Every day brought them closer to their goal, and no one outside their circle suspected the storm that was about to erupt. Even as ordinary Italians went about their lives, subtle signs began to emerge. A sudden police raid in a quiet neighborhood, an unexplained explosion in a deserted warehouse, or whispers in a university corridor hinted at an undercurrent of danger. Fear had not yet taken hold, but the seeds were being sown. The stage was being set for a series of events that would soon shatter the calm, leaving panic, confusion, and disbelief in its wake. The ordinary days of Italians, filled with routine and safety, were about to be replaced by uncertainty and terror. The calm before the storm was ending, and the shadows that had quietly gathered were preparing to strike. The first explosion struck without warning, transforming ordinary life into chaos. It happened at the heart of Bologna, a bustling city known for its markets, historic buildings, and crowded train station. Commuters hurried to catch trains, families navigated the busy platforms, and tourists admired the city's architecture. In the blink of an eye, a deafening roar shattered the rhythm of everyday life. Glass shattered, metal twisted, and a cloud of smoke and dust filled the station. Panic spread instantly as screams echoed through the corridors, and people fled blindly, some tripping over luggage, others clutching loved ones. The aftermath was horrific. Debris scattered everywhere. Bodies lay motionless among twisted steel, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of fire and smoke. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but the scale of devastation made rescue efforts chaotic. Ambulances struggled to navigate the crowded streets, and hospitals were overwhelmed with the wounded. The city's heartbeat had been abruptly interrupted, replaced by a grim pulse of fear. News outlets quickly picked up the story, broadcasting images of the destruction to the entire nation. Families across Italy watched in disbelief as the faces of the injured and the charred remnants of the station flashed across their television screens. The explosion was not just a local tragedy. It was a shockwave that reverberated across the country. Authorities scrambled to understand what had happened. Initial investigations revealed that it was no accident. Someone had deliberately planted a bomb, but there was no immediate claim of responsibility. The lack of a clear perpetrator heightened the sense of dread. Ordinary citizens began to suspect anyone who seemed unusual or secretive. Shops tightened security, commuters grew wary of stations, and neighborhoods once considered safe now felt like potential battlegrounds. Italy, a country proud of its history and culture, was suddenly gripped by an invisible enemy. For investigators, the first explosion marked the beginning of a complex puzzle. Forensic teams combed through the wreckage, searching for fragments that could reveal the bomb's origin or the group behind it. Witnesses were interviewed repeatedly, but fear made them hesitant to speak. Clues were scarce and fragmented, leaving law enforcement frustrated. Yet, even in those early days, patterns began to emerge. The sophistication of the device suggested training, and the location hinted at a desire to maximize terror. It was clear that whoever had orchestrated this attack had planned it meticulously, and it was unlikely to be the last strike. As the city of Bologna struggled to recover, a pervasive sense of vulnerability took hold. Streets that had once been lively now felt tense and suspicious. People avoided crowded areas, schools heightened security measures, and public gatherings were met with anxiety. The explosion had not only destroyed buildings and claimed lives, it had also shattered a collective sense of safety. Ordinary routines, once taken for granted, were now approached with caution, as citizens became aware that terror could strike anywhere, at any time. In homes and offices across Italy, the explosion sparked questions that had no immediate answers. Who had carried out the attack? Why had they chosen Bologna? Could this happen elsewhere? The event marked the beginning of a new era, one in which ordinary life would be overshadowed by fear and suspicion. It was the first visible sign that Italy was entering a period of darkness, where bombs, blood, and betrayal would become a recurring part of everyday existence. The calm had been shattered, and the nation's fragile sense of security would never be the same again. Investigators soon discovered that the first explosion was only the surface of a far more sinister network. Behind the attacks lay a shadowy web of extremists, skilled at concealing their identities and movements. This network was not chaotic or disorganized. It was precise, disciplined, and ruthless. Members were scattered across Italy, embedded in universities, offices, and even government agencies. Some had connections abroad, enabling them to acquire weapons, explosives, and intelligence without detection. The more authorities probed, the more they realized the enormity of the threat. This was not the work of a few disillusioned youths, but a coordinated campaign designed to destabilize an entire nation. Surveillance operations revealed the sophisticated methods these extremists employed. Messages were passed through coded letters, secret hand signals, and seemingly innocuous items like books and newspapers. Weapons were hidden in plain sight, buried beneath farm fields, stored in abandoned warehouses, or transported within everyday goods. Even family homes became storage points, making it nearly impossible for law enforcement to predict the next move. Trust was a currency the network wielded carefully. Betrayal could mean death, yet some insiders were willing to sell secrets to rival factions for power or money. This duplicity added layers of danger, as authorities could never be sure which leads were genuine and which were traps designed to mislead. The investigators were especially troubled by the involvement of ordinary citizens who were trained and educated, yet willing to commit acts of terror. Professors who shaped young minds, clerks who managed city records, and military veterans with expertise in explosives all contributed to the network's efficiency. Their ability to hide in plain sight made detection nearly impossible. In some cases, law enforcement stumbled upon extremists only after months of painstaking observation. Each discovery seemed to reveal yet another layer of planning, as if the network anticipated every possible method of exposure and countered it before authorities could act. The discovery of arms caches and encrypted communications brought a chilling realization. The network had ambitions far beyond isolated bombings. There were plans to target major political figures, disrupt public services, and create widespread panic that would weaken the government. The extremists had meticulously mapped transportation hubs, government offices, and cultural landmarks, selecting targets that would maximize both casualties and psychological impact. The sophistication of these plans made it clear that the terror campaign would not be short-lived. It would escalate, consuming entire cities in fear and chaos. Italy's citizens began to feel the invisible presence of the network in their daily lives. A casual glance at a neighbor, a coworker, or even a family friend could no longer be innocent. Suspicion crept into everyday interactions. The ordinary routines of work, school, and commuting were overshadowed by the knowledge that hidden enemies lurked among them. The fear of betrayal became a constant companion, corroding trust in communities and leaving people uncertain about who to rely on. The authorities realized that dismantling the network would require unprecedented coordination, patience, and strategy. Every step forward revealed more layers of deception, making it a battle not just of law enforcement against criminals, but of intelligence, psychology, and survival. Each uncovered secret hinted at larger, more dangerous plots yet to unfold. Italy was facing an enemy that thrived in shadows, fed on fear, and operated with relentless precision. The calm of the past was gone, replaced by the suffocating knowledge that the terror was still very much alive and growing. The attacks escalated with shocking speed, leaving Italy reeling in fear. What had begun as an isolated bombing in Bologna quickly turned into a series of coordinated strikes that spread across major cities. Car bombs tore through government buildings, shattering windows, twisting steel, and scattering debris over busy streets. Assassinations of prominent political figures and journalists shocked the nation, leaving a gaping hole in institutions once considered stable. No one was safe. The extremists' reach seemed limitless, and their ability to strike anywhere, at any time, created an atmosphere of constant vigilance and terror. Ordinary citizens bore the brunt of the violence. Families walking home from work or school suddenly found themselves caught in crossfires or near explosions. Streets once filled with laughter and chatter became silent and tense, punctuated only by the wail of sirens. Markets, cafes, and train stations, the everyday scenes of normal life, turned into potential danger zones. People learned to recognize the sound of unfamiliar vehicles, the sight of suspicious packages, and even the pattern of streetlights, fearing they could be part of an extremist plot. Public spaces transformed from areas of leisure into sites of anxiety, as the invisible threat hovered over every city, every neighborhood, every home. The psychological toll was immense. Citizens no longer trusted their surroundings, or even those closest to them. Friends, neighbors, and colleagues were examined for signs of radicalism, and ordinary gestures were sometimes misinterpreted as potential threats. Children grew up with fear as a constant companion, and parents became hypervigilant, shielding their families while struggling to explain the incomprehensible violence. The nation's sense of normalcy was eroding, replaced by suspicion and unease that spread like wildfire through communities. Law enforcement and intelligence agencies faced immense pressure. Every attack, every act of terror seemed to outpace their ability to respond. Investigators worked tirelessly, often around the clock, analyzing debris, interrogating suspects, and tracing encrypted messages. Yet the network of extremists seemed always one step ahead, adapting, planning, and executing operations with deadly precision. Even as arrests were made, the web of conspirators seemed endless, with new cells emerging in cities across the country. Each discovery of a hidden cache of explosives or weaponry brought relief, but also the chilling realization that countless other plots remained undiscovered, waiting to strike. Political leaders struggled to maintain control as the nation's fear grew. Public demonstrations and protests erupted, demanding stronger security measures, accountability, and justice. Government institutions, already targeted by extremists, faced criticism for perceived failures, creating a divide between leaders and citizens. The country appeared to teeter on the edge, with chaos threatening to overwhelm order. Yet, amidst the fear, resilience began to emerge. Communities organized themselves, neighbors protected one another, and ordinary Italians found ways to maintain some semblance of daily life. Even under constant threat, the extremists thrived on this fear. Their objective was not just destruction, but the dismantling of trust, the poisoning of relationships, and the undermining of institutions. By striking both physically and psychologically, they ensured that every attack left deeper scars than the last. Italy's cities were no longer just urban centers. They had become battlegrounds of terror, where the fight was as much against anxiety and suspicion as against bombs and bullets. The country had entered a new era, one where fear dictated behavior, and survival meant learning to live with the unpredictable shadow of violence. The betrayal came quietly, like a shadow slipping through a locked door, but its impact was catastrophic. One of the key members of an extremist cell, long considered loyal and indispensable, had begun to question the cause or perhaps feared the consequences of being caught. At first, the whispers of doubt were subtle. A hesitating glance here, a delayed message there. Yet those small cracks in loyalty were enough to set a chain of events into motion that neither the cell nor law enforcement could fully predict. This single act of treachery would alter the course of Italy's darkest years. Authorities received intelligence from the informer that revealed a major arms shipment and detailed plans for a massive attack in Rome. The information was precise, giving investigators the location of explosives, the identities of key operatives, and even the timetable for the operation. For law enforcement, it was a breakthrough and opportunity to strike a decisive blow against the network that had terrorized the nation for years. Yet, the situation was perilous. Acting too quickly could alert the extremists, while waiting risked the very attack the informant had revealed. The delicate balance of timing and secrecy became a deadly gamble. Meanwhile, within the extremist cell, suspicion began to surface. Even the most hardened members sensed that something had shifted. Plans were disrupted, meetings were suddenly moved, and operations that had previously been executed with precision now showed cracks in coordination. Paranoia spread like wildfire. Loyalty, once assumed, became a source of fear. No one trusted anyone, and the network that had once operated like a well-oiled machine began to fracture under its own weight. Members turned on one another, accusing colleagues of betrayal, while some fled, terrified that the authorities were closing in. Despite the risks, the informer's revelation led to a coordinated operation that intercepted the arms shipment and prevented the planned attack in Rome. Thousands of lives were saved, and the cell suffered its first major blow. Yet the victory was bittersweet. When the extremists discovered that a traitor had compromised them, they retaliated with brutality. Families of suspected informers were threatened, and innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire lost their lives. The betrayal, meant to prevent further bloodshed, had inadvertently caused additional tragedy, illustrating the terrifying reach and unpredictability of the extremist network. The incident also had a broader effect on the Italian population. News of the betrayal and the thwarted attack spread quickly. creating both relief and anxiety. Citizens began to understand that danger was not only external, but could exist within their communities. Even those who had never encountered extremists personally felt the weight of suspicion and fear. Trust became a fragile commodity, and ordinary life was increasingly colored by caution and vigilance. For law enforcement, the betrayal underscored a critical lesson. Dismantling the network would not only require skill, patience, and courage, but also the careful management of human psychology. One individual's choice could tip the balance between catastrophe and salvation, but the consequences of that choice could ripple outward in ways impossible to predict. In a country already scarred by years of terror, betrayal had become both a weapon and a warning, revealing the fragility of trust and the high stakes of a shadow war that had engulfed Italy. Italy began to feel as though it were at war with itself. The waves of terror had done more than damage buildings or take lives. They had fractured the very fabric of society. Neighborhoods that once shared communal bonds were now filled with suspicion, and people hesitated to engage with even familiar faces. Vigilante groups emerged in some cities, motivated by frustration at the slow pace of official investigations. Ordinary citizens, driven by fear and anger, sometimes took the law into their own hands, patrolling streets, confronting strangers, and reporting perceived threats. What had begun as acts of defense often spiraled into harassment, violence, and mistrust, further destabilizing already tense communities. Political divisions deepened as extremists exploited the chaos. Parties blamed one another for failures in security. Accusations flew in public forums, and trust in leadership waned. Campaigns to rally citizens against violence often fell flat, overshadowed by media coverage of the latest attacks and the pervasive fear of what might come next. Italy's government was under immense pressure, forced to respond with emergency measures that sometimes conflicted with civil liberties. Martial law was debated in certain regions, and curfews were enforced sporadically, further fueling resentment and uncertainty. Citizens, unsure whom to believe or where to turn for protection, found themselves caught between the visible authority of the state and the invisible threat of extremist networks. Every day brought new reports of bombings, assassinations, and arrests. Public spaces were patrolled by armed police, security cameras multiplied in streets and transit hubs, and checkpoints became a common sight in city centers. Citizens adjusted to these measures with uneasy acceptance. Their routines slowly altered to avoid potential danger. Children walked to school in pairs or under parental supervision. Workers avoided crowded transportation, and families limited evening outings. Even mundane activities, shopping for groceries, attending a cultural event, visiting a friend, were colored by awareness that violence could strike anywhere, at any moment. At the same time, extremists thrived in the atmosphere of fear. The divisions they created played directly into their objectives. Communities became fragmented, cooperation between citizens and authorities grew strained, and suspicion hampered investigative efforts. The more the population feared, the more the extremists' power and influence spread. Their ability to remain hidden while instilling chaos gave them leverage, creating the illusion that they were omnipresent, even when law enforcement was actively working against them. Media coverage intensified the psychological impact. Graphic reports, images of destruction, and live updates from the sites of attacks contributed to a growing national anxiety. Families were inundated with stories of casualties, threats, and betrayals, reinforcing the perception that no place was safe. Rumors spread quickly, some exaggerated or false, adding to the sense of paranoia. Ordinary Italians found themselves questioning friends, neighbors, and colleagues, wondering if someone close might be connected to the shadowy world of extremism. Italy's social cohesion began to erode. Communities once united by shared culture and daily interaction were divided by fear, suspicion, and ideological tension. The country's vibrant public life, the cafes, markets, theaters, and piazzas, was overshadowed by uncertainty and caution. Citizens struggled to maintain normalcy, but the pervasive influence of terror altered behavior, decisions, and relationships. The nation was caught in a vicious cycle. Fear fed division, division enabled terror, and terror reinforced fear. In this atmosphere of tension, the question on everyone's mind became unavoidable. Could Italy survive this internal war, or would it be consumed by the shadows that had grown within? After years of relentless attacks, Italy began to see the first signs of the Black Terror's unraveling. Law enforcement agencies, intelligence operatives, and undercover officers had been working tirelessly, often at great personal risk, to infiltrate the extremist networks that had terrorized cities and communities for so long. Every operation required meticulous planning and coordination, as even the smallest misstep could cost lives. Months of surveillance, analysis of encrypted communications, and careful observation finally started to yield results. Patterns emerged, safe houses were identified, and key operatives were located. For the first time in years, there was a sense of cautious optimism. The arrests began quietly but strategically. Authorities moved in simultaneously across multiple cities, capturing extremists who had believed themselves untouchable. Some were apprehended in their homes, clutching weapons and documents, while others were intercepted during clandestine meetings. These arrests were not just tactical victories. They sent a powerful message to the remaining cells that the shadowy network was no longer invincible. Rumors of betrayal, fear of exposure, and the constant threat of law enforcement began to fracture the cohesion that extremists had once maintained. The trials that followed were historic in scale. Courts were inundated with evidence, testimonies, and detailed accounts of the network's operations. Prosecutors painted vivid pictures of the bombings, assassinations, and plots that had left the nation in fear. Defense attorneys argued tirelessly, but the weight of evidence was overwhelming. Key leaders faced life sentences, and many operatives received lengthy prison terms. The judicial process, while painstakingly slow, became a cornerstone of Italy's response, demonstrating that the law could confront even the most entrenched and dangerous threats. While the arrests and convictions brought relief, they also revealed the true cost of the years of terror. Families mourned loved ones lost to bombings and assassinations. Neighborhoods bore the scars of destruction, and citizens struggled with the psychological aftermath of living under constant threat. The streets, once alive with normal activity, showed signs of cautious recovery. Rebuilding infrastructure and public spaces became a priority, but the invisible damage, fear, mistrust, and trauma remained. Survivors and witnesses carried memories of chaos and violence, reminders that the terror campaign had extended far beyond physical destruction. The extremists who remained at large faced increasing isolation. Without central leadership, communication became sporadic, plans faltered, and internal conflicts intensified. The network that had once seemed omnipresent now faced uncertainty and infighting. Fear of capture replaced the boldness that had characterized their operations, and the psychological grip they had held over cities weakened. Communities, too, began to regain a sense of control. Citizens returned to streets, markets, and public gatherings, though the lessons of the past kept vigilance alive. The fall of the Black Terror marked more than just the end of a series of attacks. It symbolized resilience. Law enforcement, intelligence agencies, and ordinary citizens had endured years of fear, uncertainty, and betrayal, and their collective efforts had dismantled one of the most dangerous networks in Italian history. Yet even in victory, the shadow of terror lingered. Memories of destruction, loss, and suspicion continued to shape behavior, reminding the nation that vigilance was essential to prevent history from repeating itself. Italy had survived, but it was forever changed. The Black Terror had tested the strength, unity, and resilience of a nation, leaving scars that could never be fully erased. The streets were safer, the extremists were imprisoned or eliminated, and the nation breathed a collective sigh of relief. but the echoes of fear and betrayal remained, woven into the fabric of Italian memory. Decades later, the memory of the Black Terror still lingered in Italy, a haunting shadow over streets and communities that had once been filled with life and laughter. Monuments and plaques commemorated the victims, their names etched into stone as a permanent reminder of the lives abruptly ended by violence. Families that had lost loved ones carried the grief silently. A weight passed from one generation to the next. Children grew up hearing stories of bombings, betrayals, and courage, understanding that the calm of the present was hard-won and fragile. Even as cities rebuilt and modernized, the psychological scars remained, shaping how people lived, moved, and interacted. The impact on society extended far beyond the immediate victims. Trust had been eroded in neighborhoods, workplaces, and public spaces, leaving communities wary of outsiders and cautious even among familiar faces. Ordinary citizens became more vigilant, scrutinizing packages, strangers, and unexpected movements. Public gatherings, once spontaneous and celebratory, were approached with caution. Life had returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the memory of unpredictability and danger had altered the collective behavior of an entire nation. People learned to live with the understanding that threats could arise from hidden corners, and that vigilance was not merely a personal choice, but a civic responsibility. Italy's institutions, too, were forever changed. Law enforcement, intelligence agencies, and emergency services adapted to lessons learned during the years of terror. Advanced surveillance methods, crisis response protocols, and interagency coordination became standard, ensuring that the nation could respond more effectively to any future threats. Politicians and civic leaders emphasized transparency and community engagement, recognizing that public trust was essential to prevent panic and maintain social cohesion. Education programs were established to teach younger generations about extremism, ideological manipulation, and the consequences of violence, instilling awareness and resilience from an early age. The cultural memory of the Black Terror was preserved through media, literature, and documentary projects. Filmmakers, journalists, and authors captured the experiences of survivors, the strategies of law enforcement, and the psychological toll of living under constant threat. Museums and exhibitions displayed remnants of the past bomb fragments, photographs, and personal artifacts, allowing visitors to confront the reality of what had occurred. These efforts ensured that the lessons of those dark years would not be forgotten, serving as both warning and memorial. Even as Italy healed physically, the emotional and psychological landscape remained layered with complexity. Families that had survived experienced post-traumatic stress, communities struggled with lingering mistrust, and individuals carried memories of fear and uncertainty. Yet, amidst the pain, resilience had emerged. Citizens rebuilt not only their cities, but their sense of community, finding strength in shared experience and solidarity. The Black Terror had tested Italy's limits, but it had also revealed the capacity for endurance, courage, and recovery. Ultimately, the legacy of the Black Terror was one of vigilance and remembrance. The nation understood that peace could never be taken for granted, and that history could repeat itself if lessons were ignored. Italy's streets were safer, the extremists imprisoned or eliminated, and public life gradually returned to vibrancy. Still, the echoes of fear and betrayal remained a permanent reminder that the years of bombs, blood, and betrayal had changed. Italy forever shaping a nation that had survived terror and emerged determined to honor its past while protecting its future.